Good evening, and a very warm welcome. Whether you are here to learn or simply to find a quiet space to rest your mind, you are in the right place. I invite you now to settle in, to find a comfortable position, and allow the world outside to fade away. Before we begin, I just wanted to say how grateful I am to have you join me. Please do leave a comment below of wherever you are tuning in from and what time it says on your clock. I always love hearing about your stories as it interconnects us like a metaphorical web. Sit back and get comfy because our journey tonight is a vast one. It is a story of a world that was brought to its knees. It is the story of the great pestilence, known to us now as the Black Death. But before we speak of the disease, of the terror and the darkness it brought, we must first understand the world it entered. For no event in history occurs in a vacuum. A great fire requires not only a spark, but also dry tinder. In the middle of the 14th century, Europe was a forest of tinder, waiting. To truly comprehend the scale of the cataclysm, we must first build, in our minds, a detailed picture of the world that was lost. A world of towering cathedrals and bustling towns, of complex trade networks and deeply held beliefs. A world that was, in its own way, both brilliant and profoundly fragile. We will take this journey slowly, step by step, through the quiet halls of history. There is no rush here. Before we begin our formal account, we would be grateful if you would share with us where you are listening from and what time it is for you now in the comments below. It is a comfort to know where our quiet community gathers in the night, a silent assembly of listeners connected across time zones and continents. Now, let us begin. Our story begins not with an ending, but with a beginning. The turn of the first millennium found Europe in a state of relative quiet. The great migrations and invasions that had characterized the early medieval period had largely subsided. The Viking longships were making their final raids. The Magyars were settling in the Hungarian plain. A precarious stability was taking hold. The population was small, the landscape dominated by vast, ancient forests. Life for most was tied to the land, governed by the seasons and the authority of a local lord. But deep, powerful forces of change were already in motion, starting with the very climate of the earth itself. From roughly 950 to 1250 AD, the Northern Hemisphere experienced a period of unusually stable and mild weather. This epoch is now known as the medieval warm period. The change was subtle, perhaps only a degree or two Celsius warmer than the centuries before or after, but its effects were profound. Winters were less severe, the growing seasons were longer. In the high Alps, glaciers receded, opening up new passes for trade and travel. In England, a climate hospitable enough for viticulture emerged, and vineyards, some as far north as Yorkshire, produced wine that was recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086. This gentle warming, this long climatic summer, was the foundation upon which the great expansion of the High Middle Ages was built. More reliable weather meant more reliable harvests, and more food, quite simply, means more people. The climatic advantage was amplified by a quiet revolution taking place in the fields. A series of technological innovations transformed European agriculture, allowing humanity to harness the energy of the land more effectively than ever before. For centuries, the primary tool for tilling the soil had been the light scratch plough, or aratrum. This was a simple wooden tool, sometimes tipped with iron, that was well suited to the dry, sandy soils of the Mediterranean basin, but it was largely ineffective against the heavy, wet, clay-rich soils of northern Europe. It could only scratch the surface. Sometime in the late Dark Ages, a new invention began to spread, the heavy-wheeled plough, or karuka. This was a far more complex and powerful machine. It had three crucial parts. First, a vertical blade called a coulter, which sliced deep into the sod. Second, a horizontal blade called a plowshare, which cut the soil at the root level. And third, and most importantly, a curved moldboard, which turned the slice of earth over, burying the surface vegetation and weeds while bringing the more fertile lower soil to the top. The heavy plow was transformative. It allowed for the cultivation of the vast, fertile plains of northern France, Germany, and England. But it was expensive, heavy, and required immense power to pull. An individual peasant could not afford one, nor did they have the animal power to operate it. Its use required the pooling of resources, fostering a more communal approach to farming, centered on the village rather than the individual homestead. This new plough was often pulled by teams of 8 oxen. Oxen are strong and steady, but they are slow. The next innovation addressed this. For centuries, the method for harnessing a horse involved a throat and girth harness, a strap that pressed against the animal's windpipe. When the horse pulled a heavy load, it partially choked itself, drastically limiting its pulling power. Then came the padded horse collar. Placed on the horse's shoulders, it allowed the animal to push with its full musculoskeletal strength. Combined with the earlier invention of iron horseshoes, which protected the hooves from splitting in damp soil, the horse became a viable alternative to the ox. A horse could work longer hours and moved at twice the speed of an ox, dramatically increasing the efficiency of ploughing and transportation. The final piece of the agricultural puzzle was a new way of organizing the land itself. The traditional method was a 2-field system. A farmer would divide his land in 2, planting one half and leaving the other half fallow or unplanted to recover its nutrients. This meant that at any given time, half of the arable land was unproductive. The new method, which became widespread during this period, was the 3-field system. The land was divided into 3 parts. One field was planted in the autumn with a winter crop, like wheat or rye. The second field was planted in the spring with a spring crop, like oats, barley, or, crucially, legumes such as peas and beans. The third field was left fallow. The advantages were immense. 67% of the land was now productive at any one time, a significant increase from 50%. It provided 2 harvests a year instead of 1, which offered a form of insurance against the failure of a single crop due to weather. The spring planting of oats provided feed for horses, further encouraging their use. And the legumes were a critical addition. Not only did they provide an important source of protein in the peasant diet, but they are nitrogen-fixing plants. They naturally replenished the soil's fertility, reducing the time a field needed to lie fallow. More food, from more land, cultivated more efficiently. These forces combined to create a virtuous cycle. The population of Europe began to swell at an unprecedented rate. It is estimated that between the year 1000 and 1300, the population more than doubled, growing from around 35 million to nearly 80 million souls. This was one of the longest periods of sustained demographic growth in human history. This explosion of life remade the landscape. A great internal colonization took place. Peasants, seeking new opportunities, pushed into the wilderness. The great forests of Europe were felled at a startling rate to make way for new farmland, a process known as assarting. Marshes were drained. Land was reclaimed from the sea in the Low Countries. New towns and villages sprang up, their names often ending in suffixes that denoted a clearing, like thwaite or ley in England or road in Germany. And with the people came the towns. While the majority of the population still lived a rural, agricultural existence, urban centres grew in size and importance. Paris, London, Florence, Cologne, these cities became hives of activity, centres of trade, learning and craft. Guilds were formed to regulate trades, ensuring quality and setting prices for everything from weaving to masonry. A new social class emerged. The burghers, or bourgeoisie, the merchants and master craftsmen who lived in the towns and derived their wealth not from land but from commerce and skill. This was the world of the High Middle Ages, a society brimming with energy, confidence and people. A civilization that built the great Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame, Salisbury, stone monuments of faith and engineering, reaching for the heavens, a physical manifestation of their soaring ambition. But this growth, this long 3-century-long summer, had a limit, and by the year 1300 that limit was being reached. The English economist Thomas Malthus, writing centuries later, theorized that population, when unchecked, grows exponentially, while food supply grows only arithmetically. Eventually, the population outstrips the resources available to it, leading to a crisis. By the early 14th century, Europe was approaching a Malthusian crisis. The population had pushed against the absolute ceiling of what the land, with its medieval technology, could provide. The medieval warm period was ending. The climate was becoming cooler, wetter, and more unpredictable. The best land was already under cultivation. Farmers were now trying to grow crops on marginal, less fertile land, on hillsides and in sandy soils, leading to diminishing returns. The world was full. It was a world stretched taut like the string of a bow, and then the string snapped. The year 1315 brought rain. It was not just a wet spring, it was a deluge of biblical proportions. A contemporary chronicler, Jean de Nouel, wrote that a great famine appeared, and the rain fell in the summer and autumn in such quantities that the peasants could not sow their lands. The rain began in May, and it did not stop. It rained through the summer and into the autumn, relentlessly. Fields became swamps of mud. Seeds that were sown rotted in the ground. The grain harvest across northern Europe was a catastrophic failure. What little grain could be harvested was often wet and mouldy. This marked the beginning of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, an event that some historians consider the true end of the High Middle Ages. The immediate consequence was a massive spike in the price of food. A society where most people lived on the edge of subsistence was suddenly plunged into starvation. The price of wheat in England, for example, increased by 800%. Salt, the only means of preserving meat, became difficult to produce as the wet weather prevented the evaporation of brine. The year 1316 was no better. The rains continued. The little seed grain that had been saved from the previous year was planted, but it too failed to yield a harvest. The crisis cascaded through the society. People ate their draft animals, their oxen and horses, for survival. This meant that even if the weather improved, there would be no animals to pull the plows. They ate their seed grain, meaning there was nothing to plant for the following year. A vicious feedback loop of misery was established. The chronicles of the time, such as those by the English monk Johannes de Trochalova, paint a horrific picture. People ate dogs, cats, rats, and the bark from trees. There are widespread, though perhaps sensationalized, reports of cannibalism. The social fabric began to tear. Parents abandoned their children. The elderly voluntarily starved themselves to allow the young to eat. Crime soared as desperate people did whatever they could to survive. Kings and lords were powerless. King Edward II of England attempted to implement price controls on food, but the merchants simply refused to sell at a loss, and the black market flourished. The church proclaimed days of fasting and prayer, but the rains continued to fall. By the time the weather patterns returned to some semblance of normality in 1317, and a meager harvest was brought in, the damage was done. The famine officially ended around 1322, but its effects lingered for decades. The death toll was immense. While precise figures are impossible to obtain, it is estimated that between 10 and 25% of the population of many cities and towns perished. But the most significant legacy of the Great Famine was not the number of dead, but the state of the survivors. An entire generation had been raised in a state of chronic, severe malnutrition. Their immune systems were compromised from birth. Disease was rampant. Typhoid, dysentery, and other illnesses swept through the weakened population. Those who had survived were biologically fragile. They were a population uniquely, terribly vulnerable to what was to come. The tinder was now bone dry. While Europe was grappling with its internal crisis of famine, the world had become smaller and more connected than it had ever been. This was almost entirely the work of the Mongol Empire. In the 13th century, under the leadership of Genghis Khan and his successors, nomadic horsemen from the steppes of Central Asia had forged, through ruthless and brilliant conquest, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. At its height, it stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the Danube River in Europe. This vast dominion, while established with immense bloodshed, created an unprecedented zone of stability and communication across Asia. This period is known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. The Mongols were not merchants themselves, but they understood the value of trade. Under their unified and strict rule, the ancient network of trails we call the Silk Road was revitalized. The the Mongols established a highly efficient system of relay stations, known as the yam. These stations, placed a day's ride apart, were stocked with fresh horses, food, and lodging. A merchant with a Mongol passport, a metal tablet called a paisa, could travel with relative safety and speed from one end of the empire to the other. Marco Polo's famous journey was made possible by this very system. This created a transcontinental superhighway for goods, ideas, and religions, but it was also a perfect conduit for disease. The western termini of this great network were the ports of the Black Sea. Here, the riches of the East were transferred to the ships of the West. And the masters of this maritime trade were the Italian city-states, chief among them the bitter rivals of Venice and Genoa. These republics had grown fabulously wealthy by acting as the middlemen between the Mongol world and Europe. They had established fortified trading posts, or fondacci, throughout the eastern Mediterranean and along the Black Sea coast. Ports like Kaffa, Tanna, and Trebizond were bustling, multicultural hubs where Genoese merchants haggled for silk, spices, and grain from the deep interior of Asia. And it was from this deep interior, from the vast arid steppes of Central Asia, that the agent of the coming catastrophe would emerge. For centuries, the plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, had existed in a stable cycle among populations of wild rodents, particularly the marmot. These burrowing animals were the natural reservoir of the disease. Occasionally, the bacterium would spill over into other rodent populations, like the black rat, which lived in close proximity to humans. And from the rats to the fleas that lived on them, it was a very short jump to people. In the 1330s, a series of ecological disasters, perhaps drought or other climate shifts on the steppes, may have caused the marmot populations to collapse. This forced the fleas that carried the plague to seek new hosts. At the same time, Mongol hunters and fur trappers were active in these regions, prized marmot pelts being a valuable trade good. A bridge was formed. The plague, which had been a localized enzootic disease of wild animals, jumped into the human population and entered the most efficient distribution network the world had ever known: the Silk Road. This brings us to the final element of our introduction, the state of medical knowledge in the mid-14th century. To understand the response to the plague, one must understand that the very concept of a germ, of a microorganism that causes illness, was completely unknown. The intellectual framework for medicine was entirely different, a complex and elegant system inherited from the ancient world. The dominant authority was Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician who lived in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. His voluminous writings had been preserved and studied for over 1,000 years, and his authority was as unassailable in medicine as Aristotle's was in philosophy. To challenge Galen was to challenge the very foundation of medical science. At the core of Galen's system was the theory of the 4 humours. This theory held that the human body was composed of 4 primary fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each humour corresponded to one of the 4 classical elements: air, water, fire, and earth, and possessed 2 qualities, such as hot and moist for blood, or cold and dry for black bile. A healthy person was one in whom these 4 humours were in perfect balance. Sickness, therefore, was always the result of an internal imbalance, a dyscrasia. Too much phlegm associated with winter might cause a cough. An excess of yellow bile associated with summer could cause anger and fever. The entire purpose of a physician was not to fight an external disease, but to help the body restore its natural equilibrium. A physician would diagnose this imbalance by examining a patient's urine in a glass flask called a matula, scrutinizing its color, sediment, and smell. They would take the pulse and consult complex astrological charts, as the planets were believed to influence the humours. Treatments were designed to remove the excess humour. If a patient was deemed to have too much blood, the treatment was bloodletting, or phlebotomy, either by opening a vein with a lancet or by applying leeches. If another humour was in excess, a doctor might prescribe emetics to induce vomiting or powerful laxatives to purge the bowels. Diet was also crucial, with different foods being classified as hot, cold, moist, or dry, and prescribed to counteract the patient's imbalance. Beyond the humours, the other great perceived threat to health was miasma, which translates to bad air or pollution. It was a deeply intuitive idea. Rotting organic matter, swamps and graveyards produced foul smells. People who lived near these places often got sick. Therefore, it was believed that the foul smell itself, the miasma, was the carrier of disease. This poisonous vapor could corrupt the air and, when inhaled, upset the body's humoral balance. To combat miasma, people would carry pomanders, which were ornate balls filled with aromatic substances like ambergris, musk, and herbs. They would burn fragrant woods like juniper and rosemary in their homes. Churches would ring their bells, not just for prayer, but in the belief that the vibrations would agitate the air and dissipate the miasma. The medical profession was itself stratified. At the top were the university-trained physicians, the physicus. They were learned men, fluent in Latin, who diagnosed illnesses and prescribed treatments based on Galenic theory, but they rarely engaged in hands-on work. Below them were the barber surgeons, who performed the practical, messy work of bloodletting, lancing abscesses, and setting bones. And finally, there were the apothecaries, who functioned as pharmacists, compounding the complex herbal remedies and potions prescribed by the physicians. And so our stage is now fully set. We have a European population that is demographically saturated and biologically weakened by a generation of famine. We have a global network of trade, a marvel of Mongol and Italian engineering, capable of transmitting anything across the known world with astonishing speed. And we have a sophisticated, deeply entrenched medical philosophy that is utterly and completely blind to the true nature of contagion. The world of the 1340s was prosperous on the surface, but it was fragile. It was a complex and interconnected system, but it had no understanding of the dangers that very interconnectedness posed. It was a civilization at its peak, and it was about to fall off a cliff. We now turn our attention from the world that was waiting, a world teeming with life, yet brittle with fragility, to the agent of its destruction. Our modern understanding of this agent is precise, clinical, and microscopic. We can name it, map its genetic code, and describe its mechanisms with a clarity born of centuries of scientific progress. To the people of the 14th century, however, it was a mystery of an entirely different order. It was a divine punishment for their sins, a malevolent vapor born of celestial alignments, an invisible and inescapable doom. It was a terror without a name, or rather with too many names. The great pestilence, the great mortality, the great dying, a terror without a face. But it did have a face, a biological one, and to understand the journey it took across the known world, we must first look at the organism itself, an undertaking made possible by work done more than 500 years after the event. In 1894, during another major plague outbreak in Hong Kong, two bacteriologists, the Japanese Kitasato Shibasaburo and the Swiss-French Alexandre Yersin, independently isolated the culprit. Though both made the discovery, it is from Yersin that the bacterium takes its modern name. The organism is called Yersinia pestis. It is a gram-negative, non-motile, rod-shaped bacillus, a simple, single-celled life form that functions as a facultative anaerobe, meaning it can survive both with and without oxygen. In its natural state, it is primarily a disease of wild rodents. It circulates for the most part in a stable and ancient equilibrium within vast, interconnected communities of these animals. The steppes and grasslands of Central Asia, a sea of grass stretching for thousands of miles, are a particular cradle for this bacterium, where it lives within populations of creatures like the great gerbil and, most famously, the marmot. In this sylvatic or natural cycle, the bacterium and its wild hosts coexist. The disease is enzootic, a permanent but low-level feature of the local ecology, causing occasional flare-ups but rarely threatening the host species with extinction. The critical bridge for this bacterium, the vector that allows it to move from one host to another, is the flea. While many species of flea can carry the plague, the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chaopis, is a superlatively efficient carrier. The process is both simple and profoundly effective. The flea takes a blood meal from an infected rodent, ingesting Yersinia pestis along with the blood. Inside the flea's midgut, the bacteria begin to multiply at an astonishing rate. They produce a biofilm, a sticky matrix that clumps together, forming a gelatinous mass that blocks the flea's proventriculus, a valve that leads to its stomach. This blockage is the key to the plague's terrifying efficiency. The flea is now ravenously, desperately hungry, but it cannot properly feed. Its digestive tract is obstructed. Driven by this insatiable hunger, it jumps to a new host, be it another rodent or a human. It bites down, sinking its proboscis into the skin and attempts to draw blood. But because of the blockage, it cannot swallow. Its sucking motion creates a vacuum, but the path is sealed. In a spasming, frustrated effort to clear the obstruction, the flea regurgitates the blood it has just drawn, now thoroughly mixed with a teeming mass of plague bacilli from its gut, directly back into the fresh bite wound. A single flea, in this blocked state, becomes a microscopic hypodermic needle, moving from host to host, trying and failing to feed, and with each bite, injecting a dose of tens of thousands of bacteria. While marmots and other wild rodents may have been the original reservoir, the bridge to the human world was almost certainly another creature, the black rat, Rattus rattus. Unlike the marmot of the distant steppes, the black rat is a commensal animal. It lives with, alongside, and upon human civilization. It is smaller and more agile than the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus, which would later displace it in many parts of Europe. The black rat is an excellent climber, preferring to nest not in sewers or burrows, but high up in the thatched roofs, wattle and daub walls, and poorly sealed attics and storerooms of human dwellings. It was the unseen and largely ignored roommate of medieval humanity. It thrived in the granaries, the marketplaces, and, most crucially for our story, in the dark, warm cargo holds of trading ships. When Yersinia pestis made the jump, likely through flea-infested grain or furs, from the wild rodent population to the ubiquitous black rat population, the fuse of the pandemic was truly lit. The plague now had a host that lived in human homes and a vector that traveled in human vehicles. When this bacterium crosses into a human host, the resulting disease manifests in three primary forms, a tripartite monster, each with its own distinctive pathology and level of terror. The most common form, accounting for the vast majority of cases during the 14th century outbreak, is the bubonic plague. After the initial flea bite, there is an incubation period of 2 to 6 days, during which the victim may feel perfectly healthy. Then, the onset is sudden and brutal. A high fever, powerful chills that rack the body, intense headaches, vomiting, and a profound sense of exhaustion and weakness. But within a day or two of these initial symptoms, the defining sign of the disease appears. The Yersinia pestis bacteria, having entered the bloodstream, are swept into the lymphatic system, the body's network for filtering out foreign invaders. They travel to the nearest lymph node, where they are trapped and begin to multiply uncontrollably. The lymph node swells dramatically in response to the massive infection, becoming a hard, painful, and hot lump known as a bubo. These buboes typically appear in the groin, the armpits, or on the neck. Their location is a simple matter of lymphatic geography. They are the nodes that drain the regions of the body most likely to be bitten by a flea: the legs, the arms, and the head. The buboes can grow to the size of a hen's egg or even a small apple. The pain is described in contemporary accounts as agonizing. If the bubo turns a dark purple or black, it is often a sign of impending death. In some cases, the pressure from the swelling becomes so great that the bubo ruptures, releasing a foul-smelling, blood-tinged pus. Without the intervention of modern antibiotics, the bubonic plague is fatal in an estimated 30 to 75% of cases. Death, when it comes, is usually the result of overwhelming infection and septic shock, and it typically occurs within a week of the first symptoms. The second form is the pneumonic plague. This is, in many ways, even more frightening. It occurs when the Yersinia pestis infection establishes itself in the lungs. This can happen as a progression from the bubonic form if the bacteria spread through the bloodstream to the pulmonary system. This is known as secondary pneumonic plague, but far more terrifyingly, it can also be transmitted directly from person to person. When an individual with a pneumonic infection coughs or even breathes heavily, they expel microscopic droplets of fluid containing the bacterium. These droplets can then be inhaled by another person, leading to a primary pneumonic infection that bypasses the flea and rat vector entirely. With this form, the very air between people becomes the medium of transmission. The incubation period is shorter, just 1 to 3 days. The symptoms are a raging fever, chest pains, shortness of breath, and a severe hacking cough that eventually produces a thin, watery sputum stained with blood. The pneumonic plague is far more lethal than the bubonic form. Its mortality rate without treatment approaches 100%. It allows the disease to spread with incredible rapidity in cold climates or during winter when people are crowded together indoors. It transforms the plague from a disease of rats and fleas into a truly human contagion. The third and most deadly form is the septicemic plague. This occurs when the bacteria do not just localize in the lymph nodes, but multiply explosively in the bloodstream itself. It can arise as a complication of the bubonic or pneumonic forms, or in some cases, it can be the primary infection from the outset. The onset is terrifyingly rapid, with high fever, chills, and extreme weakness. The defining feature of this form is what gives the Black Death its name. The bacteria cause a condition called disseminated intravascular coagulation, or DIC. Essentially, the blood begins to clot in the small vessels throughout the body, while at the same time, clotting factors are used up, leading to uncontrollable bleeding elsewhere. This manifests as widespread hemorrhaging beneath the skin, creating large, dark patches of bruised, dying tissue, a phenomenon known as purpura. The victim's skin can appear to turn dark grey or black, particularly on the extremities like the fingers and toes. This darkening of the skin, a result of circulatory collapse and tissue necrosis, is a sign that the body is being overwhelmed from within. The septicemic plague is almost universally and rapidly fatal, often killing the victim within 24 hours, sometimes so quickly that the characteristic buboes of the bubonic form do not even have time to develop. A person could, as the chronicles attest, go to bed seemingly well and be found dead in the morning. This, then, was the enemy, a multifaceted organism capable of spreading through the bite of a flea, the cough of a neighbor, or invisibly through the blood. An enemy that could kill in a week or in a day. It was an organism perfectly evolved for transmission along the arteries of human trade and settlement. And in the second quarter of the 14th century, it began its epic and devastating journey out of its ancestral homeland in the East. The precise spark that ignited the pandemic is a matter of intense scholarly debate, but compelling evidence points to the 1330s. Chronicles from the Yuan dynasty in China speak of widespread and deadly outbreaks during this period. One account from 1331 describes a pestilence in Hebei province that reportedly claimed 90% of the population. While such figures are likely exaggerations, they point to a catastrophe of immense scale. Further west, archaeological evidence provides a more concrete and poignant starting point. Near Lake Issyk-Kul, in what is now Kyrgyzstan, lies an ancient burial ground used by a community of Nestorian Christian merchants. The tombstones from the years 1338 and 1339 bear inscriptions that are starkly different from those of other years. They explicitly state that the deceased died of pestilence. This is a somber, stone-carved signpost, marking the plague's westward march along the Silk Road. It travelled with the slow, inexorable pace of medieval commerce. It moved with the caravans of camels and mules. It travelled in the bundles of marmot fur, a prized luxury good, with the fleas still dormant within the pelts. It travelled in the sacks of grain that fed the merchants and their animals, with infected rats and their fleas feasting within. It moved through the great oasis cities that studded the trade routes, Almalai, Samarkand, Tabriz. It was a slow-burning fuse moving westward year after year through the Mongol-controlled territories of Persia and Mesopotamia towards a European world that was utterly, blissfully, tragically oblivious to its approach. The flashpoint, the moment the plague leaped from the Asian landmass into the interconnected maritime world of the Mediterranean, can be traced with a high degree of certainty to a specific place and a specific year. The place is the city of Kaffa. The year is 1346. Kaffa, located on the Crimean Peninsula on the northern coast of the Black Sea, was one of the jewels in the commercial empire of the Republic of Genoa. It was a bustling, wealthy, and heavily fortified trading colony, a vital gateway through which the goods of the East flowed into the Mediterranean and onto the markets of Europe. But But in 1346, the city found itself under siege. The besieging army was a force of the Golden Horde, the powerful Mongol successor state that controlled much of modern-day Russia and Ukraine. The Mongol commander, a Khan named Jani Beg, was determined to capture the city, the culmination of a simmering conflict over trade rights and local power. The siege was a long and arduous affair, and as with nearly all large military encampments in the pre-modern era, disease became a second enemy. The pestilence that had been moving slowly westward along the trade routes erupted with furious intensity in the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the Mongol camp. The besieging army began to disintegrate from within. Soldiers died by the thousands. The Mongols' capacity to fight was collapsing under the weight of an invisible foe. It is at this juncture that we have one of the most famous and most debated accounts of the Black Death, written by a Genoese notary named Gabriele de Mussi. While historical analysis suggests de Mussi was not an eyewitness in Kaffa, he was in a position in Italy to hear the detailed accounts from the sailors and merchants who fled the city, and his chronicle captures the sheer horror of the event. According to de Mussi, Jani Beg, watching his army being consumed by the plague, decided to turn his misfortune into a weapon. In an act of desperate and malevolent genius, he ordered his men to load the plague-ridden corpses of their dead comrades onto the army's trebuchets, the great counterweight siege engines used for hurling massive stones. And he launched the dead bodies over the walls and into the besieged city of Kaffa. Stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster, ordered the corpses to be placed in catapults and lobbed into the city in the hope that the intolerable stench would kill everyone inside. And so it was that the bodies of the dead were flung over the walls and the Christians could not hide or flee or escape from them, although they dumped as many of the bodies as they could in the sea. And soon, the rotting corpses tainted the air and poisoned the water supply. Whether the Genoese defenders were infected by airborne pathogens from the corpses, by the rats that inevitably swarmed the decaying bodies, or simply by the rats that slipped through the siege lines, the result was the same. The plague erupted within the city walls. The defenders of Kaffa were now trapped in a dying city, besieged from without by a human army and from within by a microbial one. The siege ultimately broke, not by military victory, but because both sides were being consumed. In the autumn of 1347, in a desperate flight, a handful of Genoese trading galleys, their holds laden with goods and their decks laden with the dead and dying, managed to escape the charnel house of Kaffa and set sail for home. They were ghost ships. On board, sailors were already exhibiting the dreadful symptoms. Rats, the unwitting agents of catastrophe, and their infected fleas, scurried in the cargo holds among the silks and spices. These ships were not just carrying merchants, they were floating coffins, mobile incubators for Yersinia pestis, and they were sailing west, into the heart of the Mediterranean. Their first major port of call was the magnificent city of Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire. Though a shadow of its former glory, it was still a vast and populous metropolis. The arrival of the Genoese ships brought the plague ashore. The Byzantine Emperor, John VI Cantacuzene, a learned man, described the outbreak in his own history. He wrote of the sleepless, unending terror of the buboes and of the swiftness of death. He noted with a sense of democratic horror that the disease seemed to select its victims at random, sparing no one on account of wealth, status, or strength. He wrote, "The calamity did not destroy men only, but also all living animals, dogs, horses, and even the rats." His own son, Andronikos, was among the victims. Constantinople, a city that had weathered a millennium of sieges and political turmoil, was hollowed out by an enemy it could not see, but the death ships did not stay. They continued their journey, passing through the Dardanelles, across the Aegean, and into the central Mediterranean. In October of 1347, a fleet of 12 of these Genoese galleys arrived at the bustling port of Messina in Sicily. The citizens of Messina, expecting news and goods from the east, gathered at the harbour to greet them. They were met with a scene from a nightmare. The ships seemed to drift into the harbour, their oars largely unmanned. On their decks, the few sailors still alive were delirious with fever, weak and stumbling, their bodies covered in the black spots and strange, egg-sized swellings. The authorities in Messina, realizing with dawning horror that the ships carried not just cargo but a deadly sickness, immediately ordered them to leave the harbor. But it was too late. The brief period of contact had been enough. Rats, the agile ratus, had scuttled down the mooring ropes and vanished into the city's warehouses and alleys. Fleas had leapt from the sick sailors to the dock workers and townspeople who had come to greet them. The plague was now firmly ashore in Western Europe. It erupted in Messina with the speed and intensity of a fire in a dry forest. The local chronicler, Michael of Piazza, a Franciscan friar, left a harrowing account. The Messinese, seeing that this sudden death could not be avoided, chose to flee. But they carried the sickness with them, so that wherever they went, they brought death to all who received them. He described how the sick coughed up blood, and this coughing was passed from the sick to the healthy and killed them both. He lamented the total collapse of morality and compassion, noting that, if a son was afflicted, his father would not dare to approach him. Messina was consumed. Those who fled, in a desperate attempt to save themselves, became the unwitting missionaries of the plague, carrying it with them into the Sicilian countryside and to other towns on the island, most notably the city of Catania. A desperate religious procession was organized in Catania, carrying the holy relics of St. Agatha through the streets, but the crowding of the faithful only served to spread the pneumonic form of the disease faster. The entire island of Sicily was engulfed. From Sicily, the plague made the short jump to the Italian mainland. The fleeing ships from Messina, now denied entry at most ports, still managed to land at Genoa and, more significantly, at Venice, the very hearts of the commercial empires that had unwittingly imported their own doom. By January of 1348, the plague was raging in both cities. Venice, with its dense population packed onto a small archipelago, its humid climate, and its intricate network of canals, was particularly vulnerable. The Venetian government, with its characteristic civic organization, attempted some of the first coordinated public health responses in European history. They established a quarantine station on an outlying island, the Lazaretto Vecchio, where incoming ships were forced to wait for a period, eventually standardized to 40 days, a quarantena, the origin of our word quarantine, to prove they were free of disease. They appointed officials to oversee the mass burial of the dead in trenches on other islands. But these measures, while prescient, were like trying to build a dam with sand against a tidal wave. The city lost, by conservative estimates, over 60% of its population. The Venetian chronicler Lorenzo de Monacis wrote simply, "In Venice, it was a reign of death." From these great northern Italian ports, the plague spread with the relentlessness of a rising tide, moving inland. It moved along the coastal trade routes and up the river valleys. It soon reached the great city of Florence, one of the wealthiest, most populous, and most culturally vibrant cities in Europe. It is from Florence that we have our most vivid and terrifying descriptions of the plague's social impact, from the pen of the writer Giovanni Boccaccio in the introduction to his masterpiece, The Decameron. Boccaccio, an eyewitness to the devastation, provides a clinical and sociological account of a society's complete disintegration. He describes the failure of medicine. Neither the wisdom of physicians nor the power of medicine had any effect. He details the horrifying breakdown of all social and familial bonds. Brother was forsaken by brother, nephew by uncle, sister by brother, and very often wife by husband. Nay, what is more, and scarcely to be believed, fathers and mothers were found to abandon their own children, untended, unvisited, to their fate, as if they had been strangers. He describes how the sick died alone, their bodies often left in their houses until the stench alerted their neighbors. He speaks of the emergence of a new profession, the bikini or corpse carriers. These were rough men, often from the lower classes, who, for an exorbitant fee, would haul the dead from their homes on biers and dump them into the vast open pits that had been consecrated as mass graves. He describes these pits being filled to the brim with corpses, laid in layers, as merchandise is piled in the hold of a ship, with a little earth scattered over them until the trench was full. He also documents the different psychological reactions to the terror. Some people, he notes, locked themselves away in their homes, living a life of extreme moderation, avoiding all contact and hoping to outlast the pestilence. Others, believing the end of the world was at hand, gave themselves over to complete hedonism, drinking with an entire lack of restraint, and going from tavern to tavern or living in the houses of others, which they used as if they were their own. Both groups, Boccaccio observes with a grim sense of irony, died in almost equal numbers. Florence, the city that was on the verge of giving birth to the Renaissance, became a tomb. The year 1348 was the year the plague truly conquered the heart of Europe. From Italy, it spread north into France. It arrived in the bustling port of Marseille in January, and from there, it travelled up the heavily trafficked Rhone Valley. It reached the city of Avignon, which at the time was the seat of the papacy and the administrative centre of Western Christendom. The Pope, Clement VI, and his court were trapped. The Pope's personal physician, the brilliant surgeon Guy de Chauliac, left a remarkable first-hand account of the plague in Avignon. He clinically distinguished between the two forms he witnessed. The first, with continuous fever and spitting of blood, from which all who caught it died in 3 days, the pneumonic form, and the second with continuous fever and abscesses and carbuncles on the external parts, principally in the armpits and groin, from which most died in 5 days, the bubonic form. De Chauliac bravely stayed in the city, treating the sick, and eventually contracted and survived the plague himself, lancing his own bubo. He famously advised the Pope to sequester himself in his private chambers, keeping great fires burning day and night, even in the heat of summer. The official reason was to purify the miasmic air, but the intense heat likely also served to keep away the plague-bearing fleas. The Pope survived. A quarter of his staff in the papal curia did not. The plague reached Paris, the largest city in northern Europe, in the summer of 1348. The University of Paris, the most prestigious intellectual institution in the Christian world, was asked by the King of France to produce a formal report on the cause of the pestilence. After much scholarly deliberation, the learned doctors of the medical faculty issued their verdict. The ultimate cause, they concluded, was an astrological event that had occurred at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on March 20th, 1345. At that moment, a triple conjunction of 3 planets, the cold and dry Saturn, the fiery Mars, and the wet and warm Jupiter, had taken place in the 40th degree of the House of Aquarius. This powerful and malign alignment, they argued, had drawn up evil vapours from the earth and the sea, which now drifted across the world as a corrupt and deadly miasma. From France, the plague crossed the English Channel. It landed in the summer of 1348, most likely at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorsetshire. It spread with terrifying speed through the towns and villages of the West Country. Bristol, then the second largest port in England, was so badly hit that the town of Gloucester, further up the River Severn, took the extraordinary step of closing its gates, refusing to allow anyone from Bristol to enter, in a desperate but ultimately futile attempt at a local quarantine. By autumn, the plague had reached London. The city was a perfect incubator, a densely packed labyrinth of narrow, filthy streets with a population of around 70,000 people crammed into 1 square mile. The sanitation was appalling, and the black rat population was enormous. The death toll was catastrophic. The city's cemeteries were quickly overwhelmed. New emergency burial grounds had to be hastily consecrated outside the city walls. One such cemetery, at Smithfield, was excavated by archaeologists in modern times, revealing the grim reality of the mass burials, bodies laid out in neat, dense layers without coffins, in vast trenches. From London, the plague marched north, a slow, inexorable wave of death, following the main roads and riverways. By the end of 1349, it had reached the far corners of England, Wales, and Ireland. The Irish chronicler John Glynn, a friar in Kilkenny, meticulously recorded the devastation in his own community. Believing he too would soon perish, he left blank parchment at the end of his chronicle, writing a final, haunting entry. In case anyone should be left in the future, that the work may not perish, I leave parchment for continuing the work, if perchance any man survive. His handwriting stops there. Another hand later added, "Here it seems the author died." Simultaneously, the pestilence was pushing deep into the Holy Roman Empire, into the Low Countries, and into Spain. It travelled by ship to the coasts of Norway in 1349, with one famous story telling of a ghost ship, a wool freighter from England, that drifted into the harbour of Bergen with its entire crew dead, bringing the plague ashore. From these coastal entry points, it penetrated deep into the vast and more sparsely populated lands of Scandinavia, Germany, and eventually, by 1351, it had reached as far east as Russia. In the span of just over 4 years, from the shores of the Black Sea to the fjords of Norway, from the plains of Castile to the forests of Poland, almost no community of any size was left untouched. The scythe had swung across the entire continent. The world of the High Middle Ages, so full of life, commerce, and confidence just a generation before, was now a charnel house, its people grappling with a catastrophe so immense that it defied all comprehension, all
In the
medicine,
face of a
and all
catastrophe
faith.
so total and so inexplicable, a catastrophe that rendered every institution powerless, human society began to fracture. The established order, the web of obligations, faith, and laws that holds a civilization together was stretched to its breaking point, and in many places it snapped entirely. This section of our account is dedicated to the human response. The chaos, the desperate search for meaning, and the faltering attempts at medicine in a world consumed by death. The first and most primal reaction was flight. For those with the means, the instinct to escape the dying cities was overwhelming. This is vividly captured in Boccaccio's account of Florence, where he describes how the wealthy abandoned their grand city palazzi, their businesses and their civic duties, and fled to their country villas. They sought to isolate themselves from the pestilential air of the city, creating small, closed communities where they hoped the plague could not reach them. They passed their time with stories, music, and wine, attempting to build a fragile wall of normalcy against the tide of horror. But the plague was not only an urban disease, it travelled with the fleeing refugees, and death found many of them in their idyllic country retreats. For the vast majority of the population, the artisans, the labourers, the shopkeepers, the poor, there was no escape. They were trapped in the cities and towns, and it was here that the social contract dissolved most completely. The fear of contagion became more powerful than any bond of love or duty. As we have heard, Boccaccio tells us that fathers abandoned their sick children and husbands their wives. Neighbours would not so much as speak to each other, let alone offer aid, for fear that the very breath of an infected person could be fatal. The sick died alone, often in squalor. The dead lay unburied in their homes for days until the stench forced their removal. The rituals that give dignity to death, the comfort of a final farewell, the presence of family, the last rites administered by a priest, all of these were swept away. The dead were no longer individuals to be mourned, but objects to be disposed of. This collapse of society bred a profound psychological despair. The world no longer made sense. The rhythms of life, work, prayer, family were shattered. The constant ringing of church bells for the dead, the daily sight of the corpse carts making their rounds, the omnipresent fear that you or your loved ones would be next, created an atmosphere of unrelenting terror and sorrow. In this vacuum of order and hope, people searched desperately for a cause, for some explanation that could make sense of the senseless slaughter. For the medieval mind, the default explanation for any great catastrophe was divine. This was not merely a disease. This was the wrath of God, the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God, sent to punish a sinful world. Preachers delivered fiery sermons from their pulpits, enumerating the sins of humanity that had brought this judgment upon them: greed, blasphemy, vanity, and corruption within the church itself. The response, therefore, must be spiritual. Communities organized mass processions, marching barefoot through the streets, praying, singing litanies, and displaying holy relics in a desperate appeal for divine mercy. But these very processions, by gathering huge crowds of people together, often served only to accelerate the spread of the pneumonic form of the plague. When the prayers went unanswered, when the processions ended with more people sick than when they had begun, the crisis of faith deepened. From this fertile ground of terror and religious fervor sprang one of the most remarkable and disturbing phenomena of the Black Death, the flagellant movement. The flagellants were not entirely new. Small groups of self-scourging penitents had appeared during earlier times of crisis, but the movement that erupted in 1348, particularly in the German lands of the Holy Roman Empire, was on a scale never before seen. They were organized groups of laypeople, both men and women, who believed that by performing an extreme act of public penance, they could atone for the sins of the world and persuade God to lift the plague. A flagellant procession was an extraordinary and terrifying spectacle. They would march from town to town, often in groups of several hundred, wearing white robes marked with red crosses. Upon arriving in a town square, they would form a large circle. They would then strip to the waist and begin a ritual of public scourging. To the sound of mournful hymns, they would whip their own backs and shoulders with heavy leather scourges, often tipped with sharp iron studs. They would throw themselves to the ground in choreographed patterns, praying and weeping as they beat themselves into a bloody frothed ecstasy. This ritual would be performed twice a day for a period of 33.5 days, a number symbolic of the years of Christ's life on earth. Initially, the flagellants were met with awe and welcome. The townspeople, desperate for any hope of salvation, would greet them, tend to their wounds, and listen to their charismatic leaders, who preached a message of direct atonement, bypassing the authority of the established clergy. But the movement quickly grew more radical. The flagellant leaders began to claim they had received direct instructions from God in the form of a letter delivered by an angel. They began to openly criticize the wealth and corruption of the church. They interrupted church services, challenged the authority of priests, and claimed that their own rituals were more powerful than the sacraments. The church, and Pope Clement VI in particular, grew alarmed. The flagellant movement was spiraling out of control, becoming a popular and potentially heretical revolt against ecclesiastical authority. Furthermore, as the flagellants moved from town to town, they were themselves becoming vectors for the plague. In October 1349, the Pope issued a papal bull condemning the movement, and secular authorities were ordered to suppress them. The flagellants, once hailed as saviors, were now branded as heretics and hunted down. The movement, born of extreme piety and terror, was crushed by the very institution it had sought to save. When piety and penance failed, the search for a cause turned to a darker, more earthly explanation. If this was not the work of God, then perhaps it was the work of man. The fear and paranoia sought a scapegoat, a tangible enemy to blame for the invisible horror, and in a pattern that has repeated itself throughout history, the blame fell upon the outsider, the Jewish communities of Europe. For centuries, Jewish people had been marginalized in Christian Europe. Confined to ghettos, forbidden from owning land or joining most guilds, they were often forced into the profession of moneylending, an activity forbidden to Christians as the sin of usury. This made them both economically necessary and widely resented. They were a visible minority with different customs, a different language, and a different faith. When the plague struck, this long, simmering prejudice erupted into murderous violence. The accusations were monstrous and absurd. Rumors flew that a secret Jewish conspiracy was underway to wipe out all of Christendom. The primary accusation was that of well poisoning. It was claimed that Jewish people were secretly traveling the land, poisoning the wells, springs, and rivers with a concoction made from spiders, frogs, and the hearts of Christians. In some places, the fact that Jewish communities living in their segregated quarters sometimes suffered a lower mortality rate was seen as proof of their guilt. This lower rate may have been attributable to Jewish ritual laws that mandated greater personal hygiene, such as the washing of hands before meals and after funerals, or simply to the enforced isolation of the ghetto, which acted as a form of inadvertent quarantine. But to a terrified and irrational populace, it was evidence of a diabolical
Under torture,
plot.
the accused would confess. At the Château de Chillon in Savoy, a Jewish man named Aguimet, after being subjected to excruciating torment, confessed to having placed a packet of poison, given to him by a rabbi, into a well in Venice. This forced confession was then circulated as absolute proof, igniting a chain reaction of persecution across Switzerland, France, and especially the German Rhineland. The massacres were horrific. In Strasbourg in February 1349, even before the plague had reached the city, the entire Jewish population, numbering around 2,000 people, was rounded up. Those who would not convert to Christianity were taken to the Jewish cemetery and burned alive on a massive wooden platform. Their property was confiscated, and all outstanding debts owed to them were cancelled. Similar massacres occurred in cities like Basel, Frankfurt, and Mainz. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the violence, pointing out the logical absurdity of the accusations that Jewish people were dying of the plague just as Christians were, and that the plague was raging in lands where no Jews lived. But his pleas for reason were ignored. The tide of hatred was too powerful. By the time the plague had passed, hundreds of Jewish communities had been utterly destroyed, a dark and shameful stain on the history of this period. This brings us, at last, to the realm of medicine. Beyond the prayers and the persecution, what was the official medical response? What did the learned, university-trained physicians, the guardians of Galenic wisdom, do in the face of this unprecedented biological crisis? The answer, tragically, is that they were almost entirely powerless. Their entire intellectual framework was built to address internal imbalances of humors, not an external contagious pathogen. They were fighting a war with the wrong maps and the wrong weapons. Their advice to the public was based entirely on the miasma theory, the idea that the disease was carried on corrupted or pestilential air. The primary piece of advice, famously summarized as cito longe tarde, flee quickly, go far away, and return slowly, was the only truly effective measure, but it was a counsel of flight, not a medical treatment. For those who could not flee, physicians advised a host of measures to purify the air. They recommended burning aromatic woods like juniper and ash in the home. They advised people to carry pomanders, ornate metal balls filled with fragrant substances like ambergris, cloves, and rose petals, to hold to their noses when venturing outdoors. They suggested that people should avoid bathing, as it was thought that warm water opened the pores of the skin, making one more susceptible to the entry of miasma. The treatments for those already sick were a direct application of humoral theory. The buboes were seen as a sign that the body's vital heat was drawing the poisonous matter to one location. Therefore, the physician's job was to help this process along. They applied poultices to the buboes, made of things like figs, cooked onions, and yeast, hoping to draw out the poison and bring the bubo to a head. The most proactive treatment was to lance the bubo with a knife to release the venomous pus. The French surgeon Guy de Chauliac, as we have noted, attributed his own survival to this very procedure. Other treatments were aimed at rebalancing the humours. Bloodletting was widely practiced in the tragically mistaken belief that it would remove the excess, corrupted humour from the body. In reality, it only further weakened the already struggling patient. Potent laxatives and emetics were prescribed to purge the body of the poison, and complex herbal concoctions, most famously theriac, a compound medicine that could contain over 60 ingredients including viper's flesh and opium, were administered as all-purpose antidotes to no effect. The physicians themselves were terrified. They were visiting patients in rooms thick with pestilence, risking their lives with every house call. Many fled, many others died. Their failure to halt the plague, or even to explain it convincingly, dealt a severe blow to the prestige of academic medicine. And it is in this context of medical failure and immense personal risk that we must examine the figure of the plague doctor. When we hear this term, a single, powerful image comes to mind: a grim figure in a long, dark coat with a wide-brimmed hat and, most unnervingly, a beaked mask. This image has become an icon of the Black Death, a shorthand for the horror and mystery of the plague. But this image, while historically real, is also a profound anachronism. The iconic beaked costume was not widely used and likely did not exist at all during the Great Pandemic of the 14th century. It is a product of a later era. The famous uniform was invented over 270 years after the Black Death in the 17th century. Its creation is attributed to a man named Charles Delorme, a highly respected physician who served 3 French kings, Henri IV, Louis XIII, and Louis XIV. Delorme developed the costume around the year 1619 in response to the recurring outbreaks of plague that continued to sweep through Europe. His design was not a work of fantasy or intimidation. It was a head-to-toe suit of personal protective equipment, conceived entirely according to the principles of miasma theory.
It was a 17th century hazmat suit, and every single part of it had a specific, intended purpose. Let us deconstruct this uniform piece by piece to understand the medical logic behind it. The most striking feature, of course, is the mask. The mask featured round glass eyepieces, allowing the doctor to see while protecting his eyes from the bad air. From these eyepieces extended a long, hollow beak, perhaps half a foot in length, shaped like that of a bird. This beak was not for show. It was a primitive respirator. It was packed with a potent mixture of aromatic and supposedly purifying substances. The recipe for this filling, known as theriac, varied, but often included things like camphor, ambergris, mint, cloves, myrrh, laudanum, rose petals, and storax. The doctor would breathe only air that had been filtered through this fragrant medicinal buffer, in the belief that the good smells would neutralize the deadly miasma before it could enter his lungs. The rest of the costume was designed to create a complete, impermeable barrier between the doctor and the pestilential environment. Over his normal clothes, the doctor wore a long coat reaching from his neck down to his ankles. This coat was made of heavy canvas, or for the more well-equipped, of goat leather that had been thoroughly coated in scented wax. The idea was that the slick, waxy surface would prevent the miasma from clinging to the fabric. It was a non-porous shield. Beneath the coat, the doctor wore leather breeches, tightly connected to leather boots. He wore leather gloves on his hands and a wide-brimmed leather hat on his head. This hat was not merely a fashion accessory, it was part of the professional attire of a physician and was thought to offer another layer of protection. When fully assembled, the doctor was sealed from head to toe in a barrier of waxed canvas and leather. Finally, the plague doctor carried a long wooden cane or pointer. This tool had multiple practical functions. Its primary purpose was to allow the doctor to examine a patient without having to make direct physical contact. He could use the cane to lift bedclothes, to point to the location of buboes, or to feel for a pulse. He could also use it to direct the patient's family members on how to move or handle the sick person. And, in a more grimly practical sense, the cane could be used to keep desperate, terrified people at a distance. So, who were the men who wore this strange and terrifying uniform? They were a specific type of physician known as a municipal plague doctor, or medico della peste. They were not, for the most part, the elite, established physicians who treated the wealthy. They were public servants, hired by a city or town council on a special contract to treat plague victims exclusively. Because the work was so dangerous and the mortality rate so incredibly high, these positions were often filled by second-rate doctors who had been unable to establish a successful private practice, or by very young physicians just starting their careers and hoping to make a name for themselves. In some cases, they were not even trained doctors at all, but individuals from other professions who were willing to take the immense risk for the often substantial salary offered by a desperate town. Their duties, as stipulated by their contracts, went beyond just treating the sick. They were required to treat all patients, rich and poor alike. They were also tasked with keeping careful records of the plague victims, essentially acting as public health officials, logging the number of dead for the town council. In some cases, they were called upon to conduct autopsies to try and determine the cause of death, though this was often forbidden. And very importantly, because they were often the last official to see a person alive, they were frequently required to act as witnesses for the drawing up of last wills and testaments. The life of a plague doctor was one of profound isolation. They were respected for their courage, but also deeply feared as harbingers of death. Their very appearance in a neighborhood signaled that the plague was present. They were often required by their contracts to live in quarantine themselves, to avoid spreading the disease to the healthy population. They were men walking a lonely path between the living and the dead, shrouded in a uniform that both protected them and marked them as fundamentally separate from the rest of humanity. While their beaked costume belongs to a later century, the courage, the fear, and the profound powerlessness of the men who confronted the plague in any era remains a central part of this devastating story. When the first great wave of the plague finally began to recede around the year 1351, a stunned and depleted Europe emerged into a world that was both eerily familiar and irrevocably altered. The sun still rose, the seasons still turned, but the human landscape had been scoured. The silence in once bustling town squares, the sight of fields returning to scrubland, the pervasive presence of newly made orphans and widows, all spoke to a loss so immense it defied easy comprehension. The first task of the survivors, before they could even begin to rebuild, was simply to take stock of the demographic catastrophe. To count the dead is an impossible task. The meticulous record-keeping of a modern census did not exist. But from tax records, parish registers, and the chronicles of the time, historians have pieced together a devastating picture. The most widely accepted estimate is that the Black Death killed between 30 and 60% of the entire population of Europe. To put that in perspective, let us take the lower, more conservative estimate of 1/3. It means that of every 3 people who were alive in 1346, every man, woman, and child, at least one was dead by 1351. In a village of 300 people, 100 were gone. A city of 60,000 was reduced to 40,000. Some modern estimates push the figure even higher, suggesting that in certain regions, particularly in parts of Italy, France, and England, the death toll may have approached or even exceeded 60%. The mortality was not evenly distributed. Some isolated villages, by sheer luck, were spared entirely. Others were wiped out completely, vanishing from the map, leaving only the faint outlines of their foundations in the earth for future archaeologists to discover. The plague was particularly cruel to the clergy. Priests and monks who lived in close communal quarters and whose duties required them to visit the sick and administer the last rites, suffered mortality rates that were often far higher than that of the general population. Entire monasteries were emptied. The loss of this educated and literate class would have its own profound consequences. The psychological impact of this loss is difficult to overstate. The survivors lived in a world filled with ghosts. Everyone had lost someone: parents, children, siblings, friends. The very fabric of memory and community was torn. A whole generation of knowledge, skills, and traditions vanished with the dead. An old man who was the only one in his village who knew how to properly thatch a roof. A woman who was the only one who knew the location of certain medicinal herbs. A merchant whose mind held the details of a complex trade relationship. Their deaths were not just personal tragedies, but tears in the collective knowledge of their society. This demographic collapse sent shockwaves through the economic foundations of the medieval world. For centuries, the central fact of the European economy had been a surplus of labor. There were always more people than there was land or work. This reality was the bedrock of the manorial system, the dominant form of social and economic organization. Under this system, a lord owned a large estate or manor. The land was worked by peasants, most of whom were serfs. A serf was not a slave. He could not be bought or sold, but he was not free. He was legally tied to the land of his lord. He owed his lord a certain number of days of labor each week, working the lord's personal fields, the domain. In return, he was granted a small strip of land to cultivate for his own family and was entitled to the lord's protection. It was a system built on obligation, tradition, and a fundamental imbalance of power rooted in the scarcity of land and the abundance of people. The Black Death utterly inverted this reality. Suddenly, the most valuable commodity in Europe was not land but labor. In the eerie quiet of the post-plague world, a new and unprecedented dynamic emerged. Lords now had vast tracts of land, their own domain, plus the holdings of all the peasants who had died without heirs, and not enough hands to work them. For the first time in centuries, the surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of power. A lord could no longer take his workforce for granted. If a serf was unhappy with his conditions, he now had an alternative. He could simply run away. The chances of being caught were slim, and neighboring lords, desperate for workers, would often ask no questions and offer better terms. This created a competitive market for labor. Serfs began to demand concessions. They demanded fewer days of obligatory labor. They demanded lower rents. Most radically, they demanded to have their labor obligations commuted to a fixed cash payment. This allowed them to concentrate on working their own lands more efficiently and to sell their surplus produce at the market. This process marked the beginning of the end for serfdom in most of Western Europe. The old system of feudal obligation began to dissolve, replaced by a system based on cash and contracts. The relationship between lord and peasant was slowly transformed into one of landlord and tenant. This was not a change that the landowning aristocracy welcomed. They fought it at every turn. In England, the nervous nobility passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351. This law attempted to freeze wages at their pre-plague levels. It made it illegal for an employer to offer or for a worker to accept higher wages. It also forbade peasants from leaving their home manor in search of better work. Similar laws were passed in France, Castile, and other kingdoms, but these laws were almost impossible to enforce. The economic forces were simply too powerful. In the new reality of a labour shortage, landowners had to choose between letting their fields go fallow or secretly paying the higher wages the peasants demanded. The black market for labour flourished. The chronicler Henry Knighton wrote of the English situation. The labourers were so arrogant and so hostile that they took no notice of the king's command. If anyone wanted to hire them, he had to agree to their demands, for he had the choice of either losing his fruit and crops or of giving in to the arrogant and greedy desire of the labourers. Wages for agricultural workers, as well as for skilled artisans in the towns like masons and carpenters, doubled and in some cases tripled in the decades following the plague. The standard of living for the surviving common people rose significantly. They ate better, with more meat and dairy in their diets. They had more disposable income. For the first time, a sense of their own economic value began to permeate the consciousness of the labouring classes. The very landscape of Europe began to change in response to these new economic realities. With labour so expensive, labour-intensive activities like grain farming became less profitable. Landowners began to shift their focus. Many converted their arable land into pasture for sheep. Sheep farming required far fewer workers than growing wheat, and wool was a highly profitable commodity, fueling the textile industries of Flanders and Italy. This led to the enclosure of lands that had once been common, a process that would accelerate in the coming centuries, further transforming the rural economy. This newfound peasant assertiveness and the attempts by the nobility to suppress it created a dangerously volatile social climate. The decades following the Black Death were marked by a series of violent and widespread popular uprisings. The ruling classes sought to claw back the privileges they had lost, often by imposing new and regressive taxes to fund their wars and maintain their lifestyles. The peasantry, with their heightened sense of worth and rising expectations, pushed back with a ferocity that shocked the established order. In 1358, the countryside of northern France erupted in a brutal revolt known as the Jacquerie. The French nobility had been discredited by their poor performance in the ongoing 100 Years' War with England, and they tried to force the peasantry to pay for their failures through heavy taxes and forced labour. The result was an explosion of rage. Peasants armed themselves with farm implements and went on a rampage, attacking castles, murdering noble families, and committing horrific atrocities. The revolt was less a coordinated political movement and more a chaotic outburst of pure, accumulated hatred. It was eventually crushed with equal or greater brutality by the forces of the nobility, but it was a terrifying sign that the old deference was dead. A more organised and ideologically coherent uprising occurred in England in 1381. The English peasants' revolt was triggered by the imposition of a deeply unpopular poll tax, a flat tax levied on every adult. But its roots lay in the post-plague social tensions. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and a radical preacher named John Ball, a massive army of peasants and artisans from the southeastern counties marched on London. John Ball's sermons captured the new, radical spirit of the age. He preached a message of social equality, famously posing the question, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? It was a direct and powerful challenge to the entire concept of a divinely ordained social hierarchy. The rebels' demands were revolutionary. They called for the complete abolition of serfdom, the repeal of the oppressive labour laws, and the seizure of the church's vast wealth. For a few tense days, they controlled the city of London, executing the Archbishop of Canterbury and the king's treasurer. The young King Richard II met with the rebels and appeared to grant their demands, only to have the leaders betrayed and killed, and the revolt brutally suppressed. But even in its failure, the revolt achieved its long-term goal. The fear it had instilled in the ruling class was so great that no government would dare to impose a poll tax for centuries, and the process of serfdom withering away in England was greatly accelerated. The cultural and religious landscape was as profoundly altered as the economic and social one. The church, the single most powerful institution in medieval Europe, had been found wanting. Its prayers had not stopped the plague, its theology could not explain it, its priests had died in the same agonizing way as the humblest peasant. This failure led to two divergent yet related consequences. For some, it fostered a deep and lasting anti-clericalism. People grew cynical about the institutional church, its immense wealth, its political power, and the often scandalous lives of its high-ranking clergy. This sentiment would simmer for the next century and a half, providing fertile ground for the critiques of reformers like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia, and ultimately helping to pave the way for the seismic upheaval of the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. For others, the response was not a rejection of faith, but an intensification of it. They turned away from the institutional church and sought a more direct, personal, and emotional relationship with God. There was a new focus on the suffering of Christ, on the fragility of human life, and on the importance of personal penitence. This wave of intense personal piety created a demand for new kinds of religious art and literature, ones that emphasized the humanity and suffering of Jesus and the Virgin Mary. But the most pervasive cultural shift was the new and inescapable obsession with death. The experience of the plague had made death a constant and arbitrary companion. This gave rise to a morbid cultural theme known as memento mori, remember you must die. Death was no longer a distant future event to be prepared for in old age. It was an imminent and ever-present reality for all. This theme saturated the art and literature of the late 14th and 15th centuries. The most famous artistic expression of this was the danse macabre, the dance of death. In woodcuts, paintings, and murals, a series of animated skeletons are depicted leading people from every station of life in a final, grim dance to their graves. A skeleton takes the hand of a pope in his full regalia, another a king with his crown, another a wealthy merchant, a humble peasant, a beautiful maiden, and a small child. The message was simple and powerful. Death is the great equalizer. No amount of wealth, power, or piety can save you from the final democratic embrace of the grave. Finally, we must note that the Black Death did not simply arrive in 1347 and vanish in 1351. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, had now established itself within the European rat population. The pandemic became endemic. The plague returned in recurring waves, striking somewhere in Europe every 10 to 20 years for the next 3 centuries. There were major outbreaks in the 1360s, known as the pestis puerorum, or plague of the children, for its high mortality among the young, and again in the 1370s and so on, all the way up to the Great Plague of London in 1665 and the Plague of Marseille in 1720. Each subsequent outbreak was less widespread than the initial pandemic, and local populations may have developed some measure of immunity, but the constant recurring threat of the plague became a fundamental fact of European life for generations. It was this long, lingering presence that made the 17th century beaked plague doctor such a recognizable figure. The Black Death, then, was arguably the single most significant event of the last millennium. It was a demarcation line in history. It was a biological catastrophe that shattered a civilization, killing millions and plunging a continent into terror and despair. But in its destructive wake, it also acted as a ferocious and unplanned agent of social, economic, and cultural transformation. It cleared away the rigid, hierarchical structures of the high medieval world. It empowered the common person in an unprecedented way. It challenged the authority of old institutions and gave rise to new ways of thinking about society, faith, and life itself. It was the harrowing, agonizing end of one age and the violent, bloody birth of another. Our journey through the Great Mortality is, in a sense, complete. We have witnessed the world on the brink, the relentless march of the pestilence, the collapse of a society, and the slow, painful birth of a new era from its ashes. But the plague did not simply vanish when the history books closed the chapter on the 14th century. Its departure was not an event, but a process, a long, slow, and mysterious retreat that lasted for hundreds of years. And its ghost still haunts our collective memory, raising questions that could only be answered by the science of our own time. So for this final part of our account, I invite you to settle in once more. Let us explore the long twilight of the plague and the modern quest to truly know the face of the ancient enemy. As we have noted, the plague became a recurring, terrifying feature of European life. After the initial pandemic, it returned in wave after wave. The generation that survived the first onslaught saw it return to claim their children. Their grandchildren, in turn, faced it again. These later outbreaks were often less geographically widespread, but could be just as ferocious in the localities they struck. The Great Plague of London in 1665, immortalized in the Journal of Samuel Pepys, claimed an estimated 100,000 lives, a quarter of the city's population. The last major urban outbreak in Western Europe occurred in the French port city of Marseille in 1720, a horrific episode that demonstrated how, even in the Age of Enlightenment, a single ship carrying infected goods could bring a modern city to its knees. After Marseille, the plague seemed to mysteriously recede from Europe. The question that has puzzled historians for centuries is why? Why, after nearly 400 years as a recurring terror, did the plague seemingly pack its bags and leave? There is no single answer, but rather a confluence of factors, a slow turning of multiple locks that finally sealed the door. The first factor was a human one. We learned. Painfully, and at an immense cost in human lives, we learned. The rudimentary quarantine measures developed by the Venetians and other Italian city-states were refined over the centuries. By the 17th and 18th centuries, states had developed highly organized systems of public health defense. They established permanent quarantine stations, or lazarettos, at major ports. They created the cordon sanitaire, a guarded border around an infected region, preventing anyone from leaving. These measures were brutal and often draconian, but they were effective at containing outbreaks before they could become pandemics. The second factor was architectural. The very way Europeans built their homes began to change, especially in the cities. The timber, thatch, and wattle and daub houses that had been ideal nesting grounds for the black rat were slowly replaced by structures of brick and stone, with slate or tile roofs. These new materials offered fewer places for rats to live and breed in close proximity to humans. The physical separation between the human world and the rodent world began to grow. The third factor involves a change within the world of the rats themselves. Sometime in the 18th century, a new species of rat began to arrive in Europe, likely from the plains of Asia, the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. The brown rat is larger, more aggressive, and more adaptable than the black rat. It is a burrower, preferring to live in sewers and cellars rather than in the roofs and walls of houses. Over time, the brown rat displaced the black rat in many parts of Europe. This was a significant development because the brown rat's habits make it a less effective transmitter of plague to humans. It lives further away from us, and its fleas are less likely to make the jump to a human host. The slow, unobserved victory of one rat species over another may have been one of the most important public health developments in European history. Finally, it is possible that the bacterium itself evolved, or that the human population developed a greater genetic resistance to it. These are more speculative theories, but it is plausible that over centuries of exposure, both host and pathogen adapted to one another, leading to a less explosive and fatal relationship. For centuries, this was where the story ended. The plague was a historical monster, its identity as the bubonic plague largely accepted based on the vivid descriptions of buboes left by chroniclers like Boccaccio and Guida-Chauliac. But in the late 20th century, some historians began to raise doubts. They pointed to the incredible speed of the Black Death's spread and its staggeringly high mortality rate, arguing that these characteristics did not seem to match modern outbreaks of bubonic plague. They proposed alternative culprits. Perhaps it was a form of anthrax or a viral hemorrhagic fever similar to Ebola that had burned itself out. The true identity of the medieval killer became a subject of intense academic debate. The historical record alone could not provide a definitive answer. The answer would have to come from the dead themselves. The breakthrough came with the dawn of a new scientific field, paleomicrobiology, the study of ancient DNA. Scientists hypothesized that it might be possible to find the genetic fingerprints of the pathogen still locked within the skeletons of its victims. They turned their attention to the mass graves, the plague pits that had been excavated throughout Europe. The most promising place to look for ancient bacterial DNA was not in the porous bone, but in the teeth. The hard enamel of a tooth acts as a perfect time capsule, protecting the soft dental pulp inside from centuries of decay and contamination. The pulp is rich in blood vessels, and it was here that the scientists hoped to find the DNA of the bacterium that had caused the septicemic form of the plague. In the early 2010s, an international team of researchers gained permission to drill into the teeth of skeletons recovered from the East Smithfield plague pit in London, a cemetery known from historical records to have been established in 1348 specifically for victims of the Great Mortality. In a sterile, specialized cleanroom, they carefully extracted tiny amounts of material from the pulp cavity. They then used modern genetic sequencing techniques to search for fragments of ancient DNA. What they found was stunning and conclusive. They discovered thousands of fragments of DNA that belonged to a single microbe. When they pieced these fragments together, they were looking at the unmistakable genetic signature of Yersinia pestis. The debate was over. The historical accounts were vindicated. They had found the killer. Further research went even deeper. By reconstructing the genome of the 14th century bacterium, they were able to place it at the root of the plague's family tree. The strain from the London plague pit was the ancestor of nearly all modern strains of Yersinia pestis found around the world today. They had not only identified the killer, but had proven that this single pandemic event was the Big Bang that seeded the plague throughout the globe. This discovery brings with it a final, humbling realization. Yersinia pestis was not eradicated, it was not vanquished, it simply retreated. It pulled back from the human world, returning to its silent, ancient reservoirs in wild rodent populations. Today, the plague still exists. It is found in prairie dog colonies in the American Southwest, in gerbils in Central Asia, and it causes occasional but serious outbreaks in places like Madagascar and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the terror has been tamed. With the advent of antibiotics like streptomycin and doxycycline, the bubonic plague, if caught early, is now highly treatable. A disease that once brought civilization to its knees, that killed tens of millions and reshaped the course of history, has been reduced to a manageable, though still dangerous, infectious disease. And so, our long story comes to its close. The tale of the Black Death is a study in fragility. It reminds us of the thinness of the veneer of order and civilization we construct, and how quickly it can be stripped away by a microscopic organism. It is a story of terror, of despair, and of the darkness that can emerge when societies are put under unbearable pressure. But it is also, in the end, a story of resilience. Humanity did not break. The survivors rebuilt. They created new economic systems, new social structures, and new ways of seeing the world. They endured, they adapted, and they continued the slow, painstaking work of building a future, even in the shadow of an almost incomprehensible loss. The Black Death remains a part of our collective consciousness, a dark touchstone for our deepest fears about mortality, contagion, and the collapse of the world we know. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder that history is not just a story of kings and battles, but is also profoundly shaped by the silent, invisible forces of the natural world. Thank you for joining me on this long and somber journey. I hope it has been an informative and perhaps even a restful one. May your own world be one of peace, and your night one of deep and untroubled sleep. And so, we arrive at the end. Our long and winding journey through the years of the Great Mortality, a voyage across a sea of sorrow and time, has reached its final, quiet harbour. The great, heavy book of this particular history, its pages filled with shadow and strife, can now be gently closed. The story has been told. Its echo is now left to fade. The tolling bells, the whispered prayers, the cries of the afflicted, the solemn footfalls of the flagellants, the scratch of the chronicler's quill, all of the sounds we have conjured in the theatre of the mind can now fall silent. They return to the deep well of the past, to the stillness from which they came. We have been visitors in a world of profound grief, and now it is time to respectfully take our leave. I invite you now, in these final moments, to consciously let the weight of this story go. Allow the details, the dates, the names of forgotten cities and fallen kings to become like smoke, rising and dissolving into the air. Let the immense, almost unthinkable number of the dead resolve not into a statistic to be remembered, but into a quiet sense of reverence for the fragility of all things. This history is not a burden for you to carry into your rest. It is a story to be learned from and then released. For many hours we have kept company with the distant past. We have attempted to understand not just the events, but the human hearts that experienced them, and in doing so, we touch upon a profound truth, the unbreakable thread that connects us across the chasm of centuries. The fear of loss, the instinct to protect one's family, the search for meaning in the face of chaos, the simple, desperate hope for a better dawn. These are not relics of the 14th century. They are the fundamental constants of the human condition. The world changes, empires rise and fall, but the landscape of the heart remains remarkably the same. And for your part in this shared act of remembrance, I offer my deepest gratitude. Thank you, truly, for lending your time and your most precious resource, your quiet attention. In a world that constantly demands our focus with ever-increasing speed and volume, to choose to spend a space of time in slow, deliberate contemplation is a profound act. You are part of a silent assembly of listeners, gathered from every corner of the globe, connected not by wires or signals, but by a shared curiosity and a desire for peace. In your listening, this telling finds its purpose. If, by now, your eyes are heavy and my voice is becoming a more distant sound, blending with the quiet hum of your room, then that is good. That is as it should be. Do not struggle to hold on to the words. The story is over. Its work is done. Your only task now is to let go, to surrender to the gentle pull of sleep. The vast library of the past contains countless other stories, other worlds to explore. The sun-baked stones of ancient Rome, the misty shores of Viking lands, the intricate courts of Byzantium. They all wait patiently on their shelves. And should you wish to explore them, we will be here, waiting to light a candle and turn the first page with you. But for now, our work here is done. The night has its own gentle wisdom, its own quiet work to do. Let the room you are in be a sanctuary. Feel the weight of your body, secure and at rest. Notice the simple, rhythmic miracle of your own breath, rising and falling without effort. May your thoughts slow to a gentle drift, like clouds passing across a moonlit sky. May any lingering concerns of the day unravel and dissolve into the stillness. And may the deep, restorative quiet of the night envelop you completely. Until we meet again, whenever that may be, we wish you a night of profound and untroubled peace. We wish you dreams that are gentle, and we wish you a morning that greets you with quiet clarity and the promise of a new day. Rest well.